Okay, welcome back, everybody, to our third and final session of this symposium about multilingualism in Israeli literature. And let me just explain, we wanted to keep you awake. Hopefully we managed with a lot of coffee, but we also wanted to keep you awake with 3 different sessions that each one of them has a different structure and format. So this last session is gonna be different. First, we're gonna have the talk of Lital Levy, and then we're going to have a roundtable discussion with all the presenters of this day. And when Lital is done with the talk, I will ask everybody to come to this table, and hopefully we'll have a lot of time to discuss and to talk about all these things that we started, just kind of scratch the surface and really get to the depth of it. And I'm really hopeful, and I'm actually quite sure that we're going to come out with some real operative things that we're going to move forward, kind of break new ground here. We already are breaking new ground. But we'll start this session with Lital Levy, who is Associate Professor and Director of Undergraduate Studies for Comparative Literature at Princeton University. Previously, she was a junior fellow at the Harvard Society of Fellows. She specializes in contact zones of modern Hebrew and Arabic. Her research encompasses literature and film from Israel-Palestine, the 19th and 20th century intellectual history of Arab Jews, the interface of Jewish literature and world literature, and the comparative study of non-Western Renaissance and Revival movements. Her book, Poetic Trespass, Writing Between Hebrew and Arabic in Israel-Palestine, which was published in 2014, examines question of multilingualism, translation, and the cultural politics of language in Israel-Palestine. And I have to add, a fantastic book that probably influenced all of us who are working and writing on this topic. The book won the MLA Prize for First Book, the Jordan Schnitzer Book Award from the AJS, and the Salo Baron Prize. She's currently working on an intellectual history of Arab Jews in the Nahada, the modern Arabic Renaissance, and the Haskalah. And I have to add on a personal note that it's a real pleasure to have Lital, with whom I studied at Berkeley many years ago for a PhD, to have her back in Ann Arbor. This is not the first time she's in Ann Arbor, and hopefully not the last time as well. And the title of her talk is Multilingualism, Transnationalism, and World Literature, Theoretical Frameworks for Israeli Literary Studies. Please welcome Lital Levy.
Thank you so much, Shachar, for the introduction and for inviting me. And thank you, everybody. It's really been a very productive day. The papers have been great. And in some ways, I feel like everything I'm about to say has been touched on. So this is more of a kind of bringing it all together type of talk. Just get my water. Okay, so the idea is, to think through all of the categories that we have collectively been using and to try to provide some clarity, right? Offer some kind of thoughts on both the distinctions between them, the overlap, and their genealogies. So I'm going to be referencing multilingualism, of course, multiculturalism, translingualism, transnationalism, world literature, all these topics. So, in terms of thinking about distinctions, this is just one small example, because we often use these almost interchangeably. But for instance, you don't have to have a transnational frame to have a translingual or multilingual situation, right? So we've been discussing the case of Israel as a national multilingual society, but of course the pre-modern and the post-colonial are usually multilingual without necessarily being transnational. So this is just, a small example. But in what follows, I'll be mapping out these different theoretical approaches so that we can then have our discussion about how we're using them and their utility to the study of Israeli literature. So I'm going to begin by revisiting some of the models that were current and influential during the first wave of the revision of Israeli literary history. And so some of my talk is also just about kind of mapping, what we're doing now in relation to earlier stages of kind of the exploration of Israeli literature as multilingual. And these models are still very much in use. So, of course, Deleuze and Guattari's book on Kafka with the famous essay on minor literature, people are still using that. Monique Balbuena's book, for instance, was still very much in dialogue with that. So this was originally published in French in 1975, and then in English in the Mississippi Review in 1983, and finally in book form in 1986. Around the same time, coming out of a really different tradition, we get the first iterations of polysystems theory from Itamar Even-Zohar. That was in 1978. Okay, so it's interesting. Deleuze and Guattari in 75, but Even-Zohar in 1978. Now, of course, polysystems theory becomes very important for translation studies. Not just literary, but in general, translation studies, and especially for Hebrew literary scholarship, and that has a lot to do with the circumstances of its publication in Poetics Today. So, as we know, it shaped the groundbreaking work of Harshav on Hebrew and Yiddish, and then, of course, also that of Hannah Kronfeld, and many of us were influenced by Hannah. Now, in a recent essay summing up her work over many decades, that was in the Frankel Center's volume from the Year on Jewish Languages, Kronfeld kind of looks back over, this subfield of Hebrew and Yiddish, and she argues for the continued importance of a bilingual Hebrew and Yiddish literary history, working towards the larger goal of, in her words, de-ghettoizing the study of Jewish literatures. Now, the Yiddish-Hebrew scholarship that she cites, including her own work, has helped redefine the field of Jewish literary studies more broadly, not just Israeli literature, but Jewish literature, by challenging the nationalist narrative of Hebrew and by emphasizing the study of multilingual Jewish literary cultures and their contacts with other non-Jewish cultures. Non-Jewish literatures and cultures. Now, I want to add to this, thinking about Leora's point, which was a very good one, which is that in some ways we can circle back on, sort of the earlier work whose impetus was really the desire to kind of break down or deconstruct that implicit homology, between monolingualism, Hebrew, and territorial Zionism. And of course, Leora's work has been important in showing the persistence of multilingualism, but I want to emphasize that this is in a way only something that we're able to do now because of the earlier work that really did, set out to show that even the history of Hebrew literature, which was for obvious political reasons constructed as a monolingual, sort of national language history, I think that we had to kind of assume that that was the reigning operative principle because it really was for many years, at least in terms of the literary historiography, all right? So whether or not, the whole point of the scholarship is to say that, no, that didn't actually reflect the reality, but that was actually what generated most of the nationalist historiographies of Hebrew literature. And so the fact that we're able to now come along and, sort of think, in a way, circle all the way back and say, well, monolingualism is not always anti-nationalist. Sometimes, to the contrary. In a way, it's a kind of contrarian way of thinking that it's important to do that. But it also sort of, we don't want to obscure the fact that the sort of impetus for this earlier wave of scholarship was very much to point out that there was a very strong connection between nationalist monolingualism, right, and Hebrew literature, especially Hebrew literary history. So in any case, thinking about the early theoretical approaches then, it really, was very much under this kind of structuralist approach offered by Even-Zohar with, again, some, kind of references to minor literature. But there are many other approaches, formative approaches, that have been influential for different areas of multilingualism in Israeli literary studies. So I want to reference now the post-colonial turn in the discourse of multilingualism, because that started to gain traction around a decade later. And I'm talking not about now in Israeli literary studies, but just in general, right, in the late 1980s. And so that was already after kind of the first, work on Hebrew and Yiddish was underway. So one landmark monograph that I want to note is the 1989 book, The Empire Writes Back, You're probably familiar with it. It's co-authored by Bill Ashcroft, Gareth Griffiths, and Helen Tiffin. And this book considered the different linguistic strategies employed by post-colonial writers. And these would, ranging from adopting the language of the colonizer to writing in the indigenous language. Of course, these are debates that continue to this day. And then all sorts of hybrid approaches. Okay, so that's on the one hand. And then on the other hand, another work that becomes extremely important as another alternative to the kind of structuralism of polysystems theory is Derrida's monolingualism of the other, which was published in French a decade later, really, in 1996, and in English in 1998. So it's a good bit later. And Derrida's work brought the individual back into the picture and highlighted the importance of both political and psychological factors in understanding multilingualism in its social context. It problematized the notions of linguistic ownership and of language choice. And that's important because these were ideas that were just kind of taken for granted by structuralism, right? And it also brought to the table some of the problems of translation that would be further developed, much later by theorists such as Spivak and Apter. So in general, this post-colonial approach to multilingualism and translation emphasizes the role of power in shaping multilingual dynamics, and not just through a diachronic perspective, but really within any given moment of interlingual exchange, down to the code switching that characterizes communication between members of majority and minority groups. So I won't get into other figures such as Glissant, Baba, Fanon, and Said, but I will just say that if the early research on Hebrew and Yiddish as a symbiotic literary history was initially influenced by Evan Zohar and somewhat in dialogue with the Les Inguetteries, at least speaking for Hannah Kronfeld, in the late 1980s, when we start to see the early work of Hanan Hever and others like Al-Khalai and Shochat on Mizrahi and Palestinian writing and cinema in Israel, it's in dialogue with a different set of thinkers, okay, with more like the post-colonial school. Now, the interesting thing is that Hever's work was not explicitly focused on language. I mean, of course, it's always there in some respect, but he's not really, looking closely at issues of language and translation. And the work of Dror Mishani actually wasn't so much either. I mean, it was kind of more thematic, right, about like representations of the Mizrahi body and so forth. I'd say that Batya Shimoni's monograph on transit camp literature from 2008, and then 6 years later, Yochai Oppenheimer's book, From Ben Gurion Street to Shara Rashid on Mizrahi prose, and of course my own book, which those two came out the same year, 2014, we were much more focused on questions of language and bilingualism. And I mean, other people were writing about it as well, right? Multilingualism. So there was a lot of work coming out of Israel, like a lot of cultural journals, Kivun Mizrach, and stuff from Iton Shavim V'Sheva. So it's not as though we were the only ones or anything, but in terms of books, I think by this point people were more attuned to the kind of multilingualism that was coming out of the post-colonial school than by structuralism or by minor literature. Now, in tandem, I want to discuss multiculturalism as a theoretical frame. And this was the frame that was employed by Adia Mendelsohn Maoz for her own book, which was also 2014. So that's, a cluster there. That's the same year again as mine and Oppenheimer's. And I want to make a special note of her book because, to the best of my knowledge, hers is the only book that offers a multi-pronged analysis of Israeli literature that includes Mizrahi, Palestinian, Russian, and Ethiopian writing. I actually don't know of any other treatments of Ethiopian literature in Israel in a book. There have been a few articles. I might be wrong about this. So it's significant. Now, the multicultural debates in Israel, as we all know, ran very hot in the 1990s, like basically, starting with the Oslo period. And there's a lot more to say about that, post-Zionism and the expansion of television and the privatization and all of that. But, Silberstein and others have written about this. But in any case, kind of like reached its apex, right, with the apex of post-Zionism. Multiculturalism, though, is more about identity, recognition, and power sharing. It's not necessarily about language. And this actually, just an aside, it reminds me of what Alex said about how the situation of Israel before this, in the 1970s, was actually one of a plurality of cultures without multiculturalism. So that was something that I thought we could revisit. You know, like what distinguishes the plurality of cultures from multiculturalism is basically the institutional recognition, right, and the kind of power sharing. So it's not the de facto situation. So it's not necessarily focused on language, but then as Mendelssohn Maoz points out, language does become a major focus of disputes in multicultural contexts. So when you have the multicultural debates, people are arguing about language, right? Like how it's taught, about how it's used in literature and so forth. So in the introduction to her book, she discusses two distinct schools of multiculturalism, both with adherents in the Israeli Academy. So she points to what she calls the pluralist school, which is represented by Charles Taylor, Michael Walzer, and others. And their views are associated in Israel with scholars like Nissim Calderon and Gadi Taub. Okay, so that's on the one hand. And on the other hand, she sees the post-colonial school, Baba, for instance, Spivak, Fanon, and associates them with people like Shenhav, Kimmerling, Shochat, Chaver, etc. So where the post-colonial school is concerned, there's definitely a fine line between multiculturalism and multilingualism because identity is a core issue for both of those multi-areas, multiculturalism and multilingualism. But again, I think there's a real difference in that when you're talking about multilingualism, it pays close attention to questions of linguistic nuance as opposed to the sort of macro social dimensions of the multi and multiculturalism. Also, the study of multilingualism in literature concerns not only historical questions of interaction or translation between languages, which we've been discussing in great detail today, especially those we identify as national languages, like say Hebrew and Arabic, Hebrew and German, Hebrew and Russian, but it's also concerned, and something we haven't talked about as much today, with the interaction of standard languages interaction with other linguistic categories and phenomena such as dialects, patois, accents, code switching and code mixing. Shout out here to Josh Miller's wonderful book, Accented America, right? He talks a lot about that, those types of issues. And then also, very significantly, the representations of vernaculars, touching on Shachar's talk, the representation of vernaculars within standard literary languages and so forth. And these were some of the issues that I addressed in my book. So one recent book that I want to mention, or more precisely to mention again, since Shachar has also discussed it, is offering a refreshing perspective on multilingualism, is Yasmin Yildiz's 2012 book, Beyond the Mother Tongue, which it revisits the question of multilingualism in literature by historicizing monolingualism. And she describes what she calls the monolingual paradigm, okay? And basically, Yildiz argues that we have not yet moved beyond the idea of monolingualism as the norm, that, basically since Romantic nationalism, it's kind of established monolingualism as the norm, and that this norm exerts a tremendous power on 20th century literature and culture. So that even as we have newer multilingual forms and practices and new stuff is coming out all the time, they're always in tension with this monolingual paradigm, which is incredibly persistent. And so for this reason, they're seen as exceptional or even aberrant. And there are lots and lots of examples of this. Some of you might know the anthology called Rotten English. There's also Weird English. There's a lot of it, especially in English literary studies, right? So like anything that sort of engages in this kind of creolization or hybridity or, code mixing is seen as somehow weird or rotten or abnormal. So for this reason, Yildiz proposes the term post-monolingual, which denotes writing that may be multilingual, but still continues to be marked by the psychological attributes of monolingualism. And she writes in great detail about the idea of the mother tongue as a locus of identity and as a narrative. This was what Shachar referred to as, she calls it the family romance of the mother tongue, but it's basically like the narrative of origins and attachment. And her critique is that this doesn't take into account the possibility of multiple mother tongues, which is really relevant for us, right? And that it also obscures the possibility that languages other than the primary one can also become a site of emotional attachment, which of course brings us back to the work of Derrida. Okay, and Shachar also points out that Jewish multilingualism never conformed to the monolingual family romance. So although Yildiz is concerned with German, I think her work is very relevant for us. One of her fascinating examples concerns Kafka, who's multilingual as a subject. I mean, as a person, he spoke various languages, but he's effectively monolingual as a writer, and he defamiliarizes German in such a way as to make it uncanny. And this also is something that we've talked about today. Adriana had a definition of the translingual as writing in a second language or defamiliarizing the first language, right? So I found Yildiz to be really productive, for instance, for my approach to Almog Bahar, and I think it's also, her work could be useful for other forms of Israeli literature that toe the line between multilingualism and monolingualism. And again, more examples. So Adriana, for instance, talked about Schimmel as writing English and Hebrew, right? And so, we could think about some scholars have approached Kafka as writing Yiddish and German, or we could talk about Almog Bahar writing Arabic and Hebrew. And Rachel also talked today about self-translation from, you mentioned, from an acquired language to a native language as a kind of spectrality. So, I think all of these forms of spectrality or just anything that's not normative that kind of gives us pause has to do in some ways with this tension between the monolingual paradigm and the reality of multilingualism. So this brings to mind another important point, which is that not all multilingualisms are created equal, right? So when we talk about multilingualism, we're not just talking about authors who have at their disposal two languages that they're equally proficient or fluent in. I think instead multilingualism should be thought of as a spectrum, ranging from full proficiency in reading, writing, and speaking to partial proficiency in any of these areas. And this is particularly relevant for second generation or heritage speakers who may have partial to full proficiency in the vernacular form of a language, through immersion in their family, but they might have no proficiency or really limited proficiency in the literary form. This is, again, really important for Mizrahi writing, right? And this is really true for the case of Jewish speakers of Arabic in Israel, who sometimes have some colloquial Arabic at their disposal, but not literary Arabic. I suspect that it could be the case for Russian speakers, like maybe second, third generation heritage speakers, right? And so that's also one of my questions is, how can we move beyond just looking at people writing in Russian in Israel, but to see actually how maybe like second, third generation Israelis who have various languages from their families are bringing those languages into their Hebrew writing. I'm wondering how the vestiges of the other language can inform Hebrew in a wide variety of ways, which again was something that I was interested in for the case of Hebrew and Arabic. Okay, so moving on to nationalism and transnationalism. The 1980s were the apogee of literary studies of nationalism, and getting into the 1990s, again with sort of the post-colonial turn, and especially into the 2000s, we also see the transnational turn, and this is particularly pronounced in English literary studies. As we know, transnationalism has really reshaped Anglophone studies, particularly in the past 10 years. Adriana had mentioned Jahan Ramazani's 2009 A Transnational Poetics. Another book that people cite frequently is Mary Helen McMurrin's The Spread of Novels, also 2009, no coincidence. Another book, 2010, so you see it's all sort of coming out around this time, 2008, 2009, 2010. 2010, a book called Global Matters, The Transnational Turn in Literary Studies. Paul Jay argues that, quote, since the rise of critical theory in the 1970s, nothing has reshaped literary and cultural studies more than its embrace of transnationalism. I'm still quoting, this transformation has exploded under the forces of globalization, but has its roots in political movements outside the academy. During the same period, post-colonial studies emerged to challenge the primacy of discrete national literatures and what seemed like their insular concerns, providing a framework for studying literature and culture in a transnational context that moved beyond and explicitly questioned the older Eurocentric models of comparative analysis. However, the transnational turn in literary studies began in earnest when the study of minority, multicultural, and post-colonial literatures began to intersect with work done under the auspices of the emerging study of globalization. End quote. So if we accept Jay's account, that is, that the big impetus for transnationalism was globalization, then we necessarily connect transnationalism in literary studies to the type of work done by Emanuel Wallerstein in world systems theory, also very influential. And in some ways, world literature is like a continuation of this, but in some ways it's also a corrective to the system-based study. I'll talk more about that in a minute. Some approaches to world literature reinforce the center-periphery model. I'm thinking of Casanova, of course, but I'll return to this later. So this brings me now, I'm going to go back a couple years earlier to the 2005 collection Minor Transnationalism, which is edited by Françoise Lyonnais and Xu Meishi. Lyonnais and Xi forward the concept of minor transnationalism to critique the exclusion of minor and diasporic cultures and their languages from the dominant theories of transnationalism. Their introduction presents a useful critique of the connection between transnationalism and globalization. And so they see transnationalism as having challenged the nation-state-based definition of ethnic and area studies, and they agree with Jay in that respect. And now I'm going to quote a little bit more. They say, the logic of globalization assumes a universal core or norm which spreads out across the world while pulling into its vortex other forms of culture to be tested by its norm. It produces a hierarchy of subjects between the universal and the particular, with all the attendant problems of Eurocentric universalism. The transnational, on the contrary, can be conceived as a space of exchange and participation wherever processes of hybridization occur and where cultures are produced and performed without necessary mediation by the center. This definition recognizes that transnationalism is part and parcel of globalization, but also that the transnational can be less scripted and more scattered. So to paraphrase, in their view, the transnational is, redemptive in the same way that post-colonial theory kind of locates redemption in those moments of hybridity. But I also am citing them at length because of their idea of the transnational as kind of decentered, which is not everybody's concept of the transnational, right? But it's really relevant for those of us working on this question of center and Israel being the center with a diasporic, sort of culture that's still surrounding it that possibly is being reactivated, as we heard in some of the earlier papers. So I'm also going to come back to that idea. Now, I think the issue of globalization is an important and heretofore understudied aspect of Israeli literary studies. It's actually something that I don't think was mentioned today, even though we mentioned almost everything, right? I might be wrong, but I don't think anyone talked about globalization. So one question I have for everybody here is how we might think about translation and transnationalism beyond the level of the linguistic and the aesthetic, or even beyond the level of cultural history. And specifically, my question is about approaching Israeli multilingualism more through the prism of global economic relations, and then also, thinking more about transnationalism and mechanisms of distribution. Something Alex touched on this a little bit, but think about distribution, readership. Also, we touched on that a little bit in the last session. And also social media. Adriana, you've worked a little bit on social media, right? And I think that these questions are going to become increasingly relevant for culture in Israel for many reasons. I mean, not just certainly Russian culture, certainly Mizrahi culture. I mean, if we look just at what Almog Bahar is doing, it's all, and Ars Poetica in different ways, all mediated through the internet. Right, but Almog's own kind of brand of transnationalism, where he's having stuff translated into Arabic and in contact with people like in Iraq and Egypt and everywhere, it's all social media, right? And this is happening. I mean, it's in a way much more effective than the more traditional modes of contact and distribution. A related question is to what extent a focus on transnationalism will supplant paradigms of minority writing and minor literature, because I think those do tend to remain focused on language and aesthetics. And then another specific question is about diaspora as a specific kind of transnational relationship. So it's interesting because diaspora is something that other people write about, like, Xu Meishi and Françoise Lyonnais, as I just noted, talk about the sort of decentered idea of transnationalism. But when we're talking about diaspora, we're conceptualizing it in a very, culturally loaded way. I mean, when we're talking about it in the Israeli context, it is always, we can't escape it. We have this binary of homeland versus diaspora, where Israel is always going to be, the sort of spiritual center, but also in the transnational context, it's the normative nation state. And I'm wondering, if there's any way we can escape that. thinking about Israeli literature and culture transnationally, is there a way that it could complicate that old, homeland versus diaspora or nation versus diaspora? Even, thinking about Maya discussing the re-diasporization of Hebrew, why does it have to be a re-diasporization? Just a question. I'm not sure. Maybe people writing Hebrew in Germany have nothing to do with diaspora, right? Maybe it's just transnational. I'm just putting that out there as something we could think about. Maybe it doesn't have the temporal dimension. Maybe it's not a return. Maybe, So, I'm wondering if we can kind of think about a framework that's more value neutral. I'm not saying that we should. This isn't prescriptive. It's just genuinely a question. Like, how would it look if we actually took it out of that thing that we're so comfortable with about homeland and diaspora? Similarly, we can think about the movement of language, literature, and writing from foreign-born authors into Israel and the opposite, movement of writers from Israel to abroad. So, people have done a lot of work recently on Michael and Balas as writing sort of transnationally between Iraq and Israel. Or, we could think again more about the Russian language writers who have maintained some ties to Russia. Rachel convincingly discussed Wolfner as, in a way, as a kind of transnational writer. And then, of course, we can think more about these expatriate Israeli writers in places like Berlin and New York. I think, this also speaks to Leora's point that Zionism today no longer requires monolingualism. And I think in that, there are many ways in what I'm saying that we can try to move out of the older ideational frameworks that we're really bound to, with diaspora and so forth. Okay, so this brings me to the final category that I wanted to discuss today, which is world literature. Now, Alison Schachter, my collaborator, is not here. She and I became interested in the potential of world literature for Hebrew literary studies around 2010, 2011, after we'd both read Damrosch and Casanova. Just again, for some background, Damrosch came out in 2003, What is World Literature, and Casanova's book was 2004. And then we were also, reading the first wave of critiques that started coming out a couple years later. So one question that Alison and I kept coming back to was, we were interested in the potential for Jewish literary studies to be enriched by an engagement with the discourse of world literature, but we were even more interested actually in the converse and vice versa. We felt that world literature had overlooked Jewish literature and that there was a missed opportunity there because Jewish literature to us seemed to pose, a really great way to talk about the circulation of texts within a peripheral and diasporic circuitry. Precisely what, again, thinking about if transnationalism doesn't have a center, this is exactly a case like that, right? Where you don't necessarily have to pass through a center. You don't even have to have necessarily a metropolitan language. Jewish literature is translated all the time just between Jewish languages, right? Without necessarily having to pass through English, French, German, and so forth. So we were thinking about these questions of circulation and translation, since these are the fundamental mechanisms of world literature, and they're also the channels through which modern Jewish literature emerged. So we contended that the critical discourse of world literature could help us better understand the historical development of modern Jewish literatures as a multilingual phenomenon that negotiates the influences of non-Jewish culture and at the same time of internal, let's say, Jewish linguistic and cultural diversity. So that led to the article that we published in PMLA in 2015. And now in our newer work for the forthcoming double issue of Proof Text, we show how the decentered model of Jewish literatures eliminates the necessary inverse side of a normative world literature that's defined through literary competition and exchange between nations, where the world, in scare quotes, is implicitly constructed from a majoritarian viewpoint. So this is my own bias, but I do feel that world literature offers a really extensive and sophisticated toolkit for thinking about multilingual Israeli literature. In the discourse of world literature, the question of translation is strongly correlated with the problem of status and prestige of national languages within a world literary framework. So in this regard, world literature has real currency for rethinking Hebrew literary history. And I want to refer here to the discussion on the Stiebel Press. I'll come back to that again. But again, sort of thinking about this new cosmopolitan, universalist, European, idea of the world, which Naomi referenced, without a sharp distinction between Jewish and non-Jewish. I think that's more or less I'm quoting Naomi. So, that was formative for the creation of Hebrew, but that's only one strand, and I'll talk in a moment about the other strand. While Hebrew literary studies are gradually moving towards a fuller reckoning with Hebrew's multilinguality, an engagement with world literature connects this expansion to theoretical concerns about translatability and cosmopolitanism. So world literature becomes a really productive frame for thinking about, in addition to everything we've discussed today, we can also think about non-Jewish Palestinian authors working in Hebrew. Also, we can talk about Mizrahi writers working in dialogue with Arabic, which Yael mentioned. Hebrew literature written outside of Israel, Maya touched on that, but also, again, the writers who are based in the US, such as Maya Arad, Ruby Namdar. There's Ayelet Sabari, right? English language literature written on Israeli themes. I'm sorry, I should go back. Hebrew literature written outside Israel, that's Maya Arad and Ruby Namdar. And then English language literature written by Israeli authors, whether they're in Israel or outside of Israel, that's Ayelet Sabari and Shani Boyanju. And then Hebrew literature written in Israel, in Hebrew, but arguably with a translational mindset for English language commercial publishers. And everyone always talks about Edgar Keret, right? So if we talked about, maybe Kafka writing Yiddish and German, or Schimmel writing English and Hebrew, arguably Keret is also a case, perhaps, of somebody writing, Hebrew for English, whatever that might mean. So all of these cases lend themselves very well to discussions of world literature, and they all challenge the nation, language, territory homology. And again, an example of why this does still matter is the scandal after the 2015 awarding of the prestigious Sapir Prize to Ruby Namdar. So we've been saying that Zionism does not need monolingualism anymore, but Zionism does actually seem to need Israeli writers to live in Israel, okay, for better or for worse. So this, big outcry led to the newly imposed condition that the future award winners must be Israeli residents. As Allison and I argue, in the 19th and 20th centuries, Hebrew literature had a fraught and often contradictory relationship with the very concept of world literature, whose presuppositions were directly at odds with the ideology that underscored Israeli national culture. So, of course, Zionism envisioned the transformation of Jews from the quintessential minority to a national majority. This was a vexed process that shaped the unfolding of Hebrew literature to this moment, I think. And from the early 20th century onward, Hebrew writers who subscribed to variants of this nationalist ethos grappled with the normative force of world literature. They were hoping that a sovereign national status might equate with a world literary status. Okay, and again, this translation is important for this, and again, the viewpoint that's epitomized by Stiebel of translation is kind of the means to attaining this universalist cosmopolitanism. The new self-consciousness about the world, though, expressed itself as a keen sensitivity to the shifting parameters of national and ethnic identity and ever-new spatializations of Jewish culture. So the universal Jew of the European imagination became the new national subjects of a Jewish state that ironically now had to grapple with the very questions that had plagued the European nation-states within their own borders and their colonial outposts. But this time they were directed at an internal Jewish multi-ethnic and multilingual community. And this tension emerges as a central concern in the essays for our volume, which offer alternatives to the narrative of Hebrew's teleological progression from the multilingual, past to the monolingual present. But the interesting thing is that they have, what we see when we go back to this formative period in the early 20th century is that even then there are different strands that are both inviting and resisting translation and translatability. Okay, there's a strand of transnational Israeli literature now that reactivates, according to Adriana's and Maya's readings, is diasporic literary heritage. But if we go back to this question of translation in terms of the Jewish conception of the world or relation to the world in Hebrew literature, in our 2015 article for Proof Text, we were more concerned with the historical dimensions of translation in creating Jewish literature. So how did translation create reading publics? Translation as the vehicle of self-modernization, translation as the vehicle for the multilingual circulation of literature in Jewish languages. But I think because of the influence of Emily Apter's book and some other work, translation now is being really revisited as a conceptual issue. And so we're thinking more about now not just the actual practice of translating literature, but the beliefs that are espoused by authors, and in some cases characters, concerning translation's possibility, utility, and desirability. And it's really interesting how much authors like Brenner, for instance, one of our contributors, wrote about a play by Brenner that's set in London, where there's a lot of debates that are thematized about, translation and within it. And this is very common for the literature of the period, right? People are talking about, the characters are holding these debates about translation. Not surprisingly, the question of translation is always ideologically inflected, and it's linked to these debates about universality and particularism, about worldliness. So as we know, in the formative stages of Hebrew literature, translating the European canon was viewed as an essential element of the national project, right? But going back to what I was saying about Brenner, for instance, there's also a skepticism about translation in a lot of this work. That's really interesting. It's consonant with Apter's argument, right, where she claims, that she's really interested in untranslatability as a kind of deflationary gesture that would rein in world literature's expansionist tendencies and that would restore a poetics of translational difference. So maybe it's not coincidental, but Leah Goldberg actually emerged in 4 of our contributors' essays as central to these discussions of translation. And she almost becomes a discursive trope in her own right. So Goldberg is interesting because, as we know, on the one hand, she's a major force in translation of world literature into Hebrew, but at the same time, in her essays and some of her extra, her discussions, she actually offers a critique, a Jewish minority critique of world literature that challenges its universalist presuppositions. And she comes to really emblematize an exilic narrative of modern Jewish culture that's really surprisingly resistant to this ethos of, Hebrew monolingualism. So that, to us, was really interesting. We can also add, I think, Rachel Fagenberg from Naomi's talk. I'd be interested to talk to Naomi more about that in our discussion. And finally, again, I want to kind of rethink this idea of translation as a return to the past when we have our discussion. So I'm almost done. I just want to say a couple more things about world literature and Zionism with translation. It's always mediated by translation. Okay, so I talked about the sort of pre-state period where the translation of the world literary canon, which was understood as great European works, is seen as critical to the development of Hebrew. Then, of course, we get into the national phase when Hebrew enjoys an independent standing. Not to say that translation stops, but it doesn't seem to have the urgency that it had earlier. And now we're in a phase of Israeli cultural life that's, I think, really hard to characterize as national or post-national or transnational. I mean, in a political sense, I would say we're not in a post-national phase. But in terms of where sort of the various centers of gravity for Israeli literature are, they're not all in Israel. We're recognizing this. So I think one thing we could talk about is how we characterize it. I want to also reference Adriana's essay for the proof text volume about Ho, where Adriana demonstrates how translation, complemented by digital networks, is reshaping Israeli literary culture as deterritorial, diasporic, and cosmopolitan. And she sees Ho's editorial commitment to a transnational model of Hebrew writing as kind of tantamount to a re-envisioning of Israeli literature as world literature. So I'll conclude now by saying that I think the symposium indicates that we're definitely in an exciting moment of development for the field. I liked the references earlier to multiple systems of multilingual connections and cultures of aspirational multilingualism. I thought those were sort of promising characterizations. But in any case, all indications are that the horizons of Israeli literary scholarship will continue to expand, both in the direction of increased engagement with languages other than Hebrew and in the direction of more and more comparative approaches, right? As for the latter, they might take the form of direct comparison with other nation-based case studies. So in other words, it's not just about looking at sort of the comparative aspect of culture within Israel as being multilingual, but I think we're going to be seeing more and more studies that are, comparing Israeli literature to other national literatures or other ethnic literatures outside of Israel altogether. And then also another third form of comparison, I think we're going to see more and more inherently comparative theoretical frameworks, used for Israeli literary scholarship. So by revisiting these theoretical frameworks and thinking through their future potential for the study of multilingual literature in Israel, I hope that I've been able to offer some food for thought that we can continue to talk about now in our discussion about where our field may be headed in the coming years. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Lital, for this kind of summing up and also opening up to new questions and new directions. And I'm actually going to ask now all the participants, those of them who didn't go now to the bathroom or to get coffee, but if you got coffee, please come to the table so we can have a round table. It's round table is a metaphor. It's really a straight table. So Maya Barzilai, Nomi Brenner, Adriana Jacobs, Yael Kainan, Lital Wizir, Alex Moshkin, and Rachel Zillig. Spread the microphones around the table. Is everybody here? Maya? Okay, Maya went to the bathroom. All right. I'm sure she'll be back in a second. So actually, I mean, I want to let people respond to Lital's talk and the many kind of questions and terms and theoretical considerations that she brought. I also want to mention the fact that this is a good opportunity for those of us who presented earlier to go back to some of the issues that we didn't have a chance to talk about and expand on. And also this is an opportunity for everybody to ask questions. So I hope that this is going to be very much kind of an open discussion with kind of little distinction between audience and people around the table. So okay, I thought I'm going to start instead of before letting everybody respond to Lital, since we called it keywords in multilingualism and Israeli literature. There's lots of keywords here, maybe too many, right? And also part of the problem is that we, as Lital already mentioned, we use some of these terms where we're not always sure what we're talking about, right? So just to throw a few keywords that Lital mentioned and they were around the room throughout the day. So obviously we'll start with the monolingual, bilingual, multilingual. Right? And then I'm thinking here also about the translingual, which was brought as a kind of a definition of moving from one language to another, right, by Adriana, but I'm also thinking here about Naomi's book, where she uses translingual as something a lot more general, right? Something that maybe, when we mention the kind of the specter of German in writing Hebrew or Yiddish in Hebrew or Arabic in Hebrew, all these different, is that something that can help us? Thinking about it, or should we call it cross-linguistic? What are these terms? It's not that we have to reach consensus about these terms, but I'm kind of curious if this can bring the whole field forward, if we can think about it. And of course, this is also related to the issue of meta-language that was brought in many of the papers and also in Lital's book. Right, so then of course there is the issue of the vernacular and the post-vernacular, right, which, as Lital mentioned, is also related to the issue of proficiency and what does it mean for people to write in languages that, they are, what does proficiency mean in this context, right? For people who write in Yiddish or using Arabic, but these are not languages that are the mother tongue or father tongue, right? And which brings us to the other set of terms that we use, this kind of family, linguistic family romance, the mother tongue and father tongue, which is parallel or not to native tongue and to language choice. These are questions that were very much related. And then Lital urged us to think about multiculturalism, right? Whether multiculturalism is parallel in some way or not to multilingualism, and what does it mean? That came up in Alex's talk about multiculturalism in Israel as a plurality of cultures or something else. Without plurality, without multiculturalism, what does that mean? And what's the situation in Israel maybe in the 70s and right now? Now all of this obviously brings us to this whole question of diaspora, right, and nation, which Lital posed as a big question, and to the issue of power and ideology, right, whether writing in multilingualism or in many languages is necessarily or inherently going against some kind of ideological center or not, right? And also to the issue of the institutions, right? The circulation, the audience, and here I'm thinking how also in terms of temporality, we actually talking about a large spectrum of time, all the way from the 1920s with Naomi, with Shtibo, all the way to contemporary, with internet and social media and Mikan Vaelach intervening and trying to do something different. But it seems like no matter when we are talking about, the issue of the institution and circulation and audiences and modes of circulation are very important. So I don't think I added anything new here, but maybe these are the keywords that emerge, and I would ask anybody without any particular order to respond or to expand on what you were talking about before, or new insights that hopefully came as we were discussing during this day. And we'll open it also to everybody, questions and comments. So who would like to start? Yeah.
I'll jump in.
The microphones should work, so.
I don't know. Not this one. Oh, perhaps this one? No. Okay, well, I will do my best to project and to remember to project. Let me try that. So many rich things on the table. It's hard to know where to start, but I guess because Lital posed this question a few minutes ago, and I've been thinking about it, I want to take you up on the question you posed about Israeli multilingualism, specifically literary multilingualism on the global stage and also the global market. Mm-hmm. I didn't say it quite as nicely as you did, but hopefully I represented that reasonably well. Because that's something I've really been thinking about as I've been hearing the different talks today. My own work tends to focus early in the 20th century, or at least that's what I presented today. And so while I've thought about those questions in more of a historical context, which is to say, what comes to light thanks to the issues of Hebrew or Jewish multilingualism and emerging Hebrew monolingualism that might be obscured or might be very marginal or minor when we talk about the global stage. I mean, honestly, we're talking about a readership that is tiny compared to the global stage that, Casanova or others are writing about. But what can it contribute? What can it interrogate and challenge? And how do larger narratives change when we look at, this is my home territory, the kind of historical development of these things. But we've seen so many examples here of more contemporary issues. And in fact, I think we're pretty well represented from the 20s on forward. I'm sure there's some gaps there, but to really get a sense of evolution. I don't want to sketch it into a neat trajectory because, again, this is messy, this is complicated, it's interesting because it's messy. So not to try to tie things in a bow at all, but when we look at Israeli, sort of the the German writing, whether we take Rubner, for example, or the translations back into German, whether we take Israeli Russian literature, Russophone literature playing a part both in Israel but also on a larger international stage, English being another good example of this too. We see ways in which Israeli literature is participating in this global marketplace. And is it doing so as Israeli? Right? Is it being marked? And here, the Russian case very much so. The German, I would imagine, is different, again, because we have the dynamics, we have these dyads of the language pairings that matter so much too. But is it being marked as Israeli when we flip it around? When we look at this as part of a Russian diaspora, as part of we rarely talk about an American diaspora, but, American diasporic writing or transnational writing, depends which term, I'm not even sure which term to use. It's good to be very conscious about these things. As a German diasporic or German transnational writing, and de-emphasize the Israeli piece. So, while I don't necessarily have deep insights to offer about that right now, there's so much fodder here to start thinking about this, coming at it from different directions. And so that I really appreciate.
Yeah, I think go ahead.
No, you go ahead.
Just to add to that, this is also something I've been curious about with respect to these examples of English language writing by Israelis whose native language is Hebrew. So we have Ayelet Sabari and Shani Boijanu. But even earlier, in the early aughts, there was a book that came out by Oz Shelach, a book called Picnic Grounds, which was a series of vignettes, and it was highly praised by Amiel Alkalai. It got a lot of buzz for a while. Obviously, the fact that it was an Israeli writing in Hebrew, and it was a rather political work, and also Oz Shelach has an interesting personal history. His grandfather was the poet Yonatan Ratosh.
Canaanite.
Right, and a Canaanite. Also, his I don't want to get into the details. If you look him up, you'll read more about his very devastating personal history. And I actually met him in New York, and we had a coffee, and I was like, well, what's coming next? And he's like, well, I'm going to move to France. And I thought, okay, and you're planning to keep writing there? He's like, I don't know. And I was like, really? So this might be this one-off thing. And then this was almost 10 years ago, and then or more. And I looked him up recently, and there's been nothing else. His website is dormant. I have no idea if he's written in any other language since. And then and around the same time that Picnic Grounds came out, there's an Israeli in the Midwest, Gilad Elboim, I believe his name is, who had published a novel as well. And so part of me is like, is this really a phenomenon, or are these like these one-off examples that we get really excited about because they sort of give us this vista into this sort of new possibility for both the category of Israeli literature, but maybe also to expand our idea of what is American literature. But then, we don't get much more from these writers. So it seems like, what can we do with this? Shani Boijanu, for example.
Well, Ayelet's writing more. Though.
Ayelet is writing more. She also has a book she has a really nice setup, I think, right? I mean, that's the other thing. When you have like these contracts, and you have these advances to write more books, there's the incentive to write more books. I don't think this was the case for Oz Shelach. He published with us, with New Directions, but it was a small book. I'm not sure how it sold. It wasn't like he got $500,000 to write his next book. So I think these issues of economy are also complicated. I guess my question is we get really excited about these texts because I think we're also, as scholars, sort of eager and hungry and anxious for something because they touch on certain questions that we have or certain interests that we have. But then I'm never quite sure what we do when they prove to be just sort of a one-off thing for a particular author. Sort of how do we continue to sort of absorb it into our critical practice, I guess my question is.
Yeah, Rachel and Maya.
Oh, sorry. I wanted to respond to a couple of things that Lital, you brought up so many interesting issues, and I think we're probably our silence just reflects the fact that there are a lot of little mini explosions going on in our brains. But just a couple of things that you raised. One that I really appreciated that you made explicit is this idea that multilingualism doesn't necessarily equal proficiency in multiple languages, and these different sort of expressions of multilingualism, and the fact that this is sort of a spectrum. And I think that one thing that really needs to happen more in the scholarship is to focus more on the variety of multilingual practices that are taking place. So not just self-translation of a bilingual author, and what bilingual really means is also something we can interrogate, but that's just one expression, right? Then we have, of course, examples of code switching, examples of writers who are writing in different languages for different texts in different languages for different audiences. And I think that as literary scholars, that's one of the things that we need to pay a little bit more attention to, because we tend to be sort of loosey-goosey in the way that we talk about multilingual practice. One of the things that keeps coming up for me in my research and some of the writers that I work on who are working in different languages or between languages is this whole idea of sort of metaphors that come up that are antithetical to notions of fluency. So metaphors like when I talk about Rubner in more detail, one of the things I like to emphasize in his work is the stutter, that he writes a lot about stuttering, and he writes in a kind of a stutter. He comments also on his inability to read Hebrew any faster than a 6-year-old child. And that's really significant for his writing process. And I think there are other examples, writing with a lisp, writing with an accent. These are sort of motifs that also come up. So there's the practice on the one hand, and then there are also these different sort of motifs that are challenging the notion of proficiency, of mastery. I mean, Rubner actually also comments on that he hates the fact that we talk about mastering a language. Why do we have to master it? Why can't we just befriend it or something, you know? Which I think is really nice. And then just the one other thing I wanted to comment on is I really like this idea of talking about transnationalism as a means of maybe taking this discussion out of the diaspora versus homeland framework, which I think we just sort of, that's our default mode, and it's very hard to escape. And it's interesting to think in those terms, and I think especially when we look at what's going on today with, I think one of the most fascinating areas for sort of research on all of this is literary prizes. You know, so you mentioned the example of Ruby Namdar. Right, and then everyone's up in arms. Oh my God, this guy lives in New York. We better change the rules of the prize. And I often give this parallel example of just this past year, Tomer Gardi being nominated for the Ingeborg Bachmann Prize in Germany. And he lives in Israel and he writes broken German, and the title of his novel is Broken German, and it's written in bad German. And people were really upset about this, and there was this whole question like, is this an Israeli writer? Is this a German writer? Is this where do we put him? And so, you know, a lot of these categories are really coming into question. Like, how do we actually adjudicate prizes? Are these even relevant anymore? And I mean, I think that would be just a fascinating topic also for a literary study that deals with this constellation of questions. Just, do these prizes, how are they being given out, and do they even make any sense anymore in our context? Right?
Okay, so I see that Liora want to interject, so maybe before Maya, it's important to be more interactive with the...
Yeah, I just wanted to follow exactly on what Rachel is saying, which followed on what Lital is saying, which is that, you know, in my work, I was looking a lot at the field of sociolinguistics, which is dealing with a lot of these same questions, but through slightly different kinds of material. And I was just thinking about a book that was really important to me by Jan Blomard called The Sociolinguistics of Globalization. And he makes this point, and I just happen to be able to bring up the notes on my phone, where he says that multilingualism should not be seen as a collection of languages that a speaker controls, but rather as a complex of specific semiotic resources, some of which belong to a conventionally defined language, and others belong to either other languages or non-conventionally defined languages. And I think this kind of framing is really important because it's really easy to fall into like, oh, this poem is in German, this poem is in Hebrew. But then understanding this is all occurring within a kind of socio-linguistic context in which what even we define as language is quite a bit more fragmented.
Okay, so Maya and Yael and Alex.
First of all, thanks, Lital. Wow, I mean, you gave us like the whirlwind tour.
Sorry.
No, it was amazing. So, and I'm glad it's being recorded. We can go back and pause every few minutes.
I
Right,
can
and
send
think
you all the
about
notes.
Yeah. So anyway, but just I was thinking of the post-monolingual and how really, yes, how important it is for, because it comes up, right, for Yildiz very much in the German world, but how useful it might be for Hebrew literary studies, because it really, I feel there's a really strong, monolingual bias, like as you emphasized, within the nation state. That's really, in a way, it's post-monolingual in the sense that I guess there's a recognition of the multiplicity, right? But there's all the time these kind of waves of like with the Sapir Prize or even with Mikan Be'elach of kind of reclaiming Hebrew over and over and over again that I feel is very different from what's happening in Europe now. And I was thinking of Sarah Kippur's book also, Writing It Twice, and how different, we thought about in my grad seminar about how different the French prizes are and how much, French literature is trying to adopt all those writers writing in French outside of France, and to see itself as a world literature in French. Like, why is there no word literature in Hebrew in a way that kind of attempts, or why wouldn't Israel pride itself in all the writings in Hebrew that are happening across the globe? So I think that differentiation of like so I feel like it might be post-monolingual, but it's definitely national. I'm also like thinking about your challenge in terms of the diaspora, and it's that I really didn't want to re-establish that binary, and I also think like that the journal is really self-conscious, and it's the way they're using the term diasporic is like incredibly kind of self-conscious, and we need to look at it more carefully, but it's really, they quote Boyarin, they're saying that it's really about people that share their cultures with the place that they're living in. So it's less about like being like places outside of Israel versus Israel, and it's more about like Hebrew vis-a-vis German or vis-a-vis French or English or any other language where Hebrew is a minority. And in that case, and now I want to ask you to think like, I guess I see the value. I see really the value of using Hebrew literature as a critique of the framework of world literature, and I find that useful because some of the theory, as you know, that came out is incredibly vague and general, in a way that like every text that circulates tends to be, and that's of course like was Emily Apter, and you mentioned all of the criticism, but I'm wondering like what does real world literature have to contribute to our discussion? I'm still not 100% sure. Versus like translation studies or post-colonial translation studies or transnational studies that you mentioned.
I'll answer it, but why don't I answer it after
we hear
Alex
more
and
people
Yael?
on the table?
Sure. I wanted to add to a couple of things, responding both to what Lital was saying, what Adriana, and actually this whole day. I think that another key word that we can think of is what's the best adjective to put before the literature that we're working on. Jewish, Hebrew, Israeli, we've all used them, and they're not in any way interchangeable. And I think that and I think that what we're seeing here is that it's never, one adjective is never enough, which I think is fantastic, that's good. But we should think about how, what terms we're using, and is there in fact one term, or are there multiple terms, and that becomes an important notion in and of itself. And the second thing that I was wondering was how much of this is in the literature that we're reading, echoing what Adriana was saying, but in a slightly different direction. How much of this is in the literature that we're reading, and how do we take that to other areas? How canonical is this Is this multilingualism seen in the public sphere in a sufficient way or not? Can we talk about it sort of a post-monolingual literature, but an exceedingly national public sphere? And what does that mean about the relationship between those two things? Does that mean that the literature is in fact not describing or not doing something that the public discourse is not really doing in the same way, almost going in opposite directions in some ways?
About what you just said about the label, I absolutely struggled with this when describing the writers I'm working on, because they're kind of Russians, kind of Israelis, and then when you say to them that they're Russian, they're like, I'm not Russian, I'm Jewish. And then you say the same thing like in Hebrew and then get offended. So it's very difficult, the question of description. And there is this group on the internet, maybe you know, Dor 1.5, Generation 1.5, Alex Schlief and the others, who label themselves not as Russian-speaking Israelis, but Hebrew-speaking Russians, because for them, Hebrew became the vehicle of bringing their culture out. And what you said, Lital, about social media, and anyone, I think, who's working on contemporary literature of the last 25 years realizes how big of a part Facebook and other in email okay, I'll give a few examples. Some of you received emails from Edgar Keret when he collaborated with Miranda May and some other celebrities, and you would receive like snippets of their emails about like different topics. Or Alex Epstein, who did the Facebook book, when he had like an album on Facebook, and every page it's like a short story, so you like click through a Facebook and it becomes a Facebook book. Speaking to them about their different experiments, and Alex Epstein was very famous at trying to go against Timatsky's and saying that selling books is not like buying tomatoes at a discount, 3 for 100, 4 for 100. And he started self-publishing his literature. So the institutions, the national institutions, are definitely moving somewhere else. And somewhere else is the virtual literary space, which is extremely important. And when talking to Alex Epstein and Zoe Cherkasky, Israeli-Russian painter, who talking to them about the role of the internet, for them, internet, Facebook become a way to communicate with their readers, to be actively engaged with them. And for them, the discussions that are going on in the comments are just as important as the work itself. A lot of the time, they're transgressive. They are instantly, immediately shocking things, or it's like almost avant-garde performances that they do for the benefit of other people to see how they reply. So yes, I think we definitely need to integrate social media in.
And just a short comment following up is that also really when we only look at literary publication, we're really limiting ourselves in terms of what we understand in terms of multilingualism, because like no one is shocked when Rutum Mudan publishes like Exit Wounds first in Hebrew, and it like, you know, it gets
graphic novel, right?
Yeah, a graphic novel, or that films come out, you know, first in English or whatever, like, or music or anything like that. No one, it's just not even at all like an issue, and then later they're translated or everyone reads them in another language, in English or. And I think there's something about the literariness or the literary Hebrew word that's really gets essentialized or fetishized.
Yeah, well, maybe that's what you're saying is partly what explains the Mikan Vailach insistence on not being online, being only, which can be read in multiple ways, as you said. You know, it can be read as kind of nostalgic, looking back to the Berlin of the 1920s, but it can be read as kind of insistent. Okay, we want to differentiate ourselves from all these cultural spheres that are going on in social media and do something that is kind of old-fashioned and you know, something that puts literature at the center. Maybe that's one way to look at it, which is interesting.
if I could add, sorry, just one example from music, thinking of a group like Somali who do Arabic, who sing in Arabic, Hebrew, and Russian, and are not canonical, not in a major label so far as I know, and it's sort of, I think, an interesting model. They have language that's very, sort of plays on different registers and different languages.
Yeah.
And they're great, you should listen to their music.
Music is a whole other.
Yep.
There's so much interesting stuff happening in music. I'll just respond to Maya's question. I mean, to fully answer the question, I'd have to give a full accounting of world literature, which I cannot do right now, of course. And I will also say that, when the issue comes out, of course, you'll see, I think, just how much world literature does have to offer, Jewish literature and Hebrew literature. But I will say that I have found it incredibly productive. First of all, again, I thought that even in the earlier phase, just for what we did for our proof text article, just as a way to kind of bring the different areas of Jewish literary studies into conversation with each other, it provided a really useful frame. I think that this type of, also what's happening, what the seminar that's going to be happening at ACLA next summer, at least in its original conception. I mean, I think there are more and more efforts to try to break through the, small, we're in like our little fiefdoms, or at least we were. I think it's breaking down now, but for a long time, there was the school that was working on Hebrew and Yiddish, and that's still by far the largest and most developed school of, Hebrew or Jewish, let's say, literary multilingual studies. And then there's, a smaller group of people working mainly in Hebrew and Arabic. There are people in Hebrew, German, Yiddish, people in Hebrew, Russian, Polish or Russian, the people working in like Latin American Jewish literatures. And the question that Allison and I asked ourselves is, how do we bring all of this into conversation in some way that makes sense? And, when you took the sort of tools of world literature, it makes it possible to do that, for one thing. That was what we tried to do in the PMLA issue. Now, world literature itself as a sort of, very diffuse theoretical discourse has been evolving and it's been moving in new directions. So the kind of recent phase now is much more conceptual and much more engaged with sort of the way, historicizing the way in which the very notion of the world or worldliness was produced through kind of a return to understanding, Orientalism. So it's not just kind of thinking about the circulation of texts in a really general sense, but looking specifically at things like, how were sort of the libraries of Oriental classics produced by British publishers? How were, sort of like the idea, how was the idea of the Western canon produced in tandem with, sort of colonialism's project of creating, great works of Oriental literature, things like that. And some of it has to do with looking at the actual, production of books, the circulation of books, like very materially, like book history, creation of libraries, the creation of catalogs, and some of it is conceptual, like how through these processes were people imagining the idea of a world or a world literature, what were, sort of what were the processes that were involved both historically and economically and conceptually, and how did they interact? So I find that to be really exciting. I love it. So I think in terms of how that informed our thinking about Hebrew and Jewish literature, again, sort of going back to questions like, Stiebel's role in creating modern Hebrew literature. It is all of those things. It is, exactly the types of things that Naomi was discussing, where there's an ideological viewpoint that informs it. There's a commercial aspect. There's the creation of lists. There's the creation of great Yiddish library or great Jewish library, like all these greats. The sort of the impetus to sort of have an idea of what is world literature and bring it into Hebrew. So all of these things are sort of directly engaged with the discourse of world literature. That's where it's also an opportunity to make Hebrew literature more relevant to people outside our own field, to the broader community of people in comparative literature, I think, by showing that sort of these things were also relevant to the creation of Hebrew as a national literature, that, and especially I think for Hebrew literature because of people like Leah Goldberg or Grudzinski or others. So that's sort of the short answer. I think it has a lot to offer.
And I should add, though, that translation into Hebrew is really under-theorized. It's like,
yes.
It's been like, there are all these studies that record, like, these and these works were translated in 100 and something, just like you. And numbers, and there's a whole book just about all the different, like just noting all the different types of books that were translated from German into Hebrew in the pre-48 period, but it's absolutely not theorized.
Right.
It's
There's
not
no,
theorized.
there's no history either.
And the texts aren't read, right? And the texts aren't read in terms of like really getting, I mean, it can be tedious work, but it can also be important work at its best when you really get into the nitty gritty, which and we've actually seen, people doing today in a variety of different ways. Here, I actually think that, and I was telling Adriana this at lunch, not that there weren't lots of fascinating examples, but the last text on her handout where she is kind of constructing a source, right? And it's as constructed as the other sources, but really points to when you work with the text and you theorize them and you historicize them. Historicization, check, it's not done, but there's been much more on that than on any of the other accounts.
And just to add, like, avenues how to do that, when I was during the summer in the National Library of Israel, all of the translations are tagged, and there's a law in Israel. It's once you publish a book in Israel, you have to send a copy to the National Library. So this is really easily accessed and can be like done just to show like the progression of translation to Israel, like when the years went up or went down.
I'm thinking about the National Library, how kind of going back to what Yael was saying, it's unclear even with the National Library, is that Israel National Library or the Jewish National Library, right? They're going back and forth even with that. They changed their name,
Very
right?
incomplete name change, right? That's part of their
great
sort of
point.
reinvention.
Yeah,
but
what is it called right now?
It
Can you
used to
remind-
be very clearly
The National Library in
the Jewish
National and University.
and University Library.
JNUL.
And the books
now
are
it's-
still stamped
And
that
yes.
because you're not going to go cross them all out. But now it's the National
Library
Library of
of
Israel.
Right.
Because that's so much less complicated.
Well, it goes back to your point about
It's the
Israeli
shift from
versus
Hebrew
Jewish.
to Israeli.
But Jerusalem,
happens.
speaking of your Jerusalem fragment, I think Jerusalem used to be in the name too, like the National Library in Jerusalem.
Well, they
Maybe.
began before Israel.
Yeah, you don't
Yeah.
get before
It was
Israel.
very much, the emphasis was very much about it being in Jerusalem specifically,
And being
and the University of Jerusalem, and they're trying now,
Right.
obviously, to.
And now that there is this international competition about the architecture and building the new building, we'll see where that will take us. But yeah, questions from the audience here.
Kind of add to the discussion. I'm thinking about Gary Steingart was commenting at some point about exile literature and what how he thinks he relates to immigrant literature, how he thinks he relates to immigrant literature, and he said that it just doesn't make sense anymore to talk about immigrant literature. That what does it mean? How can he be writing in the tradition of Russian Jewish immigrants to the United States when he can get on a plane 6 hours later he's in St. Petersburg, and he keeps an apartment in St. Petersburg as well, and he's back and forth all the time, and it's just a whole different notion of immigrant literature. And all of much of what you've been talking about reminds me of that phenomenon that just literature is so global now. And with Israel in particular, it's interesting because it is a country that tries to define itself on its language more than most, but yet is such a multilinguistic country. And it's kind of that contrast that strikes me as interesting, that brings about a lot of the phenomenon that you're talking about. But the global nature of literature now is such that these issues about the prizes, whether you can give the German literary prize to an Israeli writer, whether the same debates are happening in Canadian in particular, right? So Canada, all of the great Canadian writers live in the United States, in Melbourne, and that's a problem. And Canada has it not only for writers, but Canada has something called canned content, which is that on radio and television, there has to be a certain amount of Canadian content. It's whatever 30% of the radio in Canada has to be Canadian content. That's why you hear Rush all the time in Canada. But it's very complicated now, because how do you define that Canadian content? If the producers are living here and they've got an apartment in New York, and sometimes they're in New York and sometimes they're there, and everything, everything's all, nobody's where they're supposed to be, right? Everybody's all mixed up in different places. So it's kind of a global phenomenon that Israel's at a hub of for a variety of reasons. And then the other example I keep thinking of is Jhumpa Lahiri, right, who's now decided to move to Italy, learn Italian, and write her next book in Italian, in a language that she didn't know, 5 years ago, but that she learned from scratch and then decided to now become an Italian novelist. It's also just another interesting phenomenon along those lines. So really, my comment is really just about the globalization of the phenomenon that you're dealing with, which Lital actually got to quite nicely in your comments, by the way.
I just want to, I certainly agree, and I think we see this just sort of, on Facebook or whatever form of social media, and we can also see this in a more traditional academic sphere. But I do want to suggest that Jewish literature in particular was never not global.
Right.
Exactly.
It's the visibility, it's the speed, it's the communication. So the way in which we apprehend the global nature of it, that has changed and is changing as we speak. I keep scribbling down more and more things I want to look at. I'm not aware of this, that, and I can go, tonight and tap into all of them, right? I mean, that's not, other than the actual logistics, it's not hard to do anymore. But I think it always was global. And that goes back to the point that Lital made. It was a different world. So, and we also have to be careful about overstating the global, right? I mean, do we want to say global and really say European or Western or North African, Middle Eastern? And so it's important to be careful about those things. I think those points are still well taken in terms of what are we calling global and what perhaps are we forgetting or overlooking. But even if the mechanisms change and the way in which we apprehend it changes, I still think there's a good case to be made for many of these things going much further back than we generally think about them.
What do you mean by many of these things? Many of what things?
The interactions, the circulation of individuals, the circulation of text, the circulation of languages.
So I want to actually add something about that. So, I mean, again, to kind of go back to what Allison and I were trying to do. So that was sort of the first point that we were trying to make in our first article, was precisely that, that yes, I mean, Jewish culture, I wouldn't necessarily use the term global, but certainly the very emergence of modern Jewish literature was characterized by those processes of the transmission of either Jewish texts, within different Jewish languages, or we used your work on the Gothic novel for the Mystère de Paris for our other example, like an originally non-Jewish source text that then circulates from one Jewish language to the next Jewish language, and that process of transmission was completely embedded in those, sort of new technologies, and that it was, characterized by the speed. We also made the point that Jewish languages, that materials had always circulated among Jewish languages, and that was what was different about the modern case was not necessarily the circulation itself, but the technologies of the circulation and the dissemination, and the newspaper, the feuilleton, all of that. So yes, I completely agree with all of that. At the same time, that's different than talking about the universal and the global in terms of the ideologically invested conception of what those things, come to mean in the late 19th and 20th century. And that's a different question. And that was sort of what we're coming to in the second essay, which is that, and this is in conversation with Amr Mufti's work also, so on the one hand, yes, Jews are seen as being universal in the sense that they're everywhere. And at the same time, Jews are sort of the epitome of the particular, right? And so, in a way, it's like you have this weird paradox at the very heart of the definition of the Jew in relation to the world. The Jew is not worldly, right? I mean, so there's this problem that has to be negotiated, not just, it's about Jews, and also Jews have to negotiate it for themselves in terms of, again, sort of the relationship to Hebrew literature as a national literature that's going to take its place on the global stage. So that was sort of, again, to get back to the question about world literature, that's sort of what we were trying to explore, is this question of, discourses by and about Jews looking at themselves in relation to the world, how they, Allison, opens with this anecdote about Leivik, is it? The Yiddish writer going to the Penn Club in Buenos Aires and giving this impassioned speech about Yiddish and using these terms of sort of universal And I mean, it's just like rife with contradictions all the time. You know, like a language that has sort of no inherent national territory of its own. On the one hand, that imparts a kind of universality, but it's also like not global in a sense because it's too particular. It's not a language that belongs to the world. It's a language that only belongs to Jews. You know, so there's a really serious instability at the very core of, you know, Jewish self-definition in terms of these labels of like global and universal in particular. And that's the tension that continues to get played out through these translation projects, you know, through the work of Leah Goldberg and Stiebel, and through these debates that are taking place both in the newspapers and then even internally within the literature, where you have characters talking about these questions, like should the identity of Hebrew be a, you know, universal language on the global stage, or should it be a really particular national language? Like these, you know, these questions are being examined. So, yeah, Maya.
Just you mentioned Leah Goldberg in your talk and now too, and I just want to add, maybe to even make things worse, like the archives that are. And the phenomenon that Hebrew literature is being really enriched by you know, the republication of works that have been archived and by multiple, and these works are actually incredibly, and I want to use the term diasporic because they're originating, like for example, I'm thinking of Roman Gunai and Avidot and all and these other texts that are like, were not published, but because of these reasons. And thinking about Leah Goldberg's revision of Avidot, like she never published it, but she revised the first chapter, and she turns her main character into a translator. And he translates the 1001 Nights. So I just think that's a great example, you know, of how she kind of rethinks his position instead of just diasporic terms, but in world literature terms, maybe.
Yeah.
Right. And just to clarify, I mean, those works that you're referring to, Maya, they were often not published, not just because of the institutions, but the writers themselves didn't want to publish them. But for us today, these are great works of literature. Yeah.
I just want to add to two things. One, another qualification to this notion of globalization or the ease of movement, I think is really crucial to mention the fact that in the area that we're talking about, there are people and literature, but mostly people whose movement is constantly restricted, and so that's a whole other sphere that we have to talk about that can't be sort of cast aside. And that also makes me think about, we've been talking about Hebrew as this sort of a language that moves around, and the concept of Jewish literature is something that's not tethered to one place, at least certainly not historically, and that's sort of a direction that we're interested in. I wonder how that aligns with thinking of literature in a regional sense. So reading about one place or the same place in different languages, how that aligns with that. I'm thinking of my own experience reading Emil Habibi's short stories about Jerusalem and realizing how incredible it is to read that with the accounts that I know better from Hebrew literature about Jerusalem, thinking about a book like Khoury's Bab Hashem's Gate of the Sun, and the experience of reading that along with the sort of the narrative that we know from indoctrination in the Hebrew or Israeli education system. So I wonder if that might not be, not necessarily to replace that, but to think of that as another avenue.
Yeah, that's a very good point. I mean, we tend to think maybe because Israel is so small, we don't think about regions in Israel. And also I'm thinking about what Lital said in terms of dialects, you know, like this is in American literature, it's a huge area, and we don't think about it so much in Israeli literature, but many writers are actually using it, you know, writing Hebrew and trying to do it, whether it's artificial or not, that's a different question. But what was the novel? I forgot that about Shum Gamadim Lo Yavo, Sarah Shiloh, right? Trying to write in the language of somebody who grew up in Kiryat Shmona, I believe, in a development town, and kind of this like Mizrahi that it's kind of like almost broken Hebrew, like the broken German. So that's another element that somehow I think might be related to the regional and the dialects that. Even though Israel is very small, it's important when we think about these different areas or literature about the kibbutz or about whatever it's going to be. So, yeah.
Thank you for this, because I was going to say just the same. If we are thinking about transnationalism and cosmopolitanism, we should also paired with the critique of cosmopolitanism and transnationalism that's going on, about the distorted movement of people. Latour called cosmopolitanism war plan disguised as a peace plan. So there's definitely inequality, world inequality, that also world literature can help us explore. Also, I think that transnationalism and excessive movement of people, cultures, and everything else, at least in the case of Russian literature, does not really negate the importance of the nation state. If I'm thinking about Russian literature that is created in America in Russian language, in America, in Israel, and other places, most of the writers who want to succeed and who will be able to reach the masses has to do it through Moscow. The literary critics are those that pretty much market and create celebrities out of them. I was talking to an Israeli Russian writer in Jerusalem who went to a local store and she had 200 books of hers, she's a well-known writer, and she wanted to give it to the bookstore so they will sell it. Because they ran out of her book. And they said, no, we don't do that. We'll contact Moscow so they will send it to us. So this absurd, like the new imperial structures continues to this day. The world is a wheel that has to go through Moscow through center. So the importance of Moscow is not diminishing in the post-Soviet world.
But we see this, this is also the case of, someone like Maya Arad, who writes in Hebrew, has been in California most of her adult life. But her work circulates within Israel. It's published in Israel, it's reviewed in the Israeli press in Hebrew. Her readers are, by and large in Israel. And so it's nice to think of, this sort of like diasporic Israeli writer. But the reality is that her work is entirely reliant on Israeli institutions, on an Israeli book market, and economy. And I don't think we're anywhere close to being completely changing that particular model. So I completely agree. The Moscow hub has always been very fascinating for me, right? But I see that also at work with Israeli writers abroad. Even Mikan Ve'elach, right? It's the amount of attention it's gotten in Haaretz is really fascinating.
Wow.
And I also wanted to point out, because the comment about social media, it was interesting there that Tal got into this discussion with Gali Lokem, who someone had submitted these poems. The title in English, it was Berlin Cycle. And Tal was like, I'm going to publish this
Berlin Zyklus.
Yes. And, but so he asked if he could put as the location, which, by the way, what a very Recherche sort of thing to do, to put like location and date at the end of a literary text. I feel like we're in the early 20th century again. So he wanted to put Berlin and the date of composition. She said, no, I didn't write them in Berlin. He's like, but does it matter? They're mostly about Berlin. She's like, but I didn't write them there. And it was like, well, then, right, she couldn't put Jerusalem. He's like, well, we can't include this. So, as much as we talk about, and they didn't include it.
They didn't. Although I can add, by the way, that I communicated with Tal, and he explicitly wanted to include in the next volume works coming from Israel, but if they conform to this kind of idea of diasporic Hebrew.
Yeah. So it's interesting because we talked a little bit, and Lital mentioned this as well in her talk, about how, part of the work that we're doing is about challenging and dismantling this sort of fiction of a kind of monolingual, territorial Hebrew culture. But I also see the risk of doing this as well with this diasporic Hebrew culture. And that's fascinating for me, that it can also reproduce the very thing that it's trying to dismantle.
Sure, and some people in Haaretz who wrote a review of Mikan Ve'elach actually mentioned this poem, the Tzelan, as the only example of this real diasporic Hebrew, because the point was, okay, so the writers are in Berlin or in LA or in New York, but they write in Israeli Hebrew. So what is the diasporic Hebrew here? Which is another interesting question to ask. Yeah, Mustafa.
Yeah, just it's interesting to see from the discussion talk about Israel and globalism, or Hebrew culture and globalism, that there is something that is missed out from the discussion is that let's say the travel of the Hebrew text from Israel to the neighboring Arab countries. So no one has talked about this, and even like Amos Oz, for example, has been translated into Arabic recently. Ili Amir, Yasmin was translated to. And what does it mean? Why the authors would agree for their text to be translated? Also, Al-Mughbihar, his book about Chahla and Haskell, also translated by Nail Tuhi. And his poem that he wrote in his novel, not novel, a short stories for Animina al-Yahud, Animina al-Yahudim, was translated in Arabic by Muhammad Abdu. He's an assistant professor at Cairo University. And I know if there is, are we still talking about the internal Jewish, even by Jewish scholars talking about the internal Jewish relationship? And when we talk about the Hebrew culture in the global sense, the Arab discourse is almost overlooked. Maybe just Salman Natur and Mahmoud Darwish, just like this. And is there a message that you wanted to convey from this, or just it is left out not intentionally? Are we still seeing Israel as a country, the Western country, in the Arab world, and it's more in conversation with the West than with the East? Taha Hussein was translated into Hebrew, Najib Mahfouz as well. Najib Mahfouz, he got a Nobel Prize, and I think he is one of the people who contributed to the world literature.
I'm happy to talk about this question because I actually talked about translation at length in my book, and since then there's been more developments. But I mean, basically, there's two completely different ways of looking at this question. Okay, so I can give you sort of the optimistic view and the pessimistic view.
I wanted to say, is it like a message? Because
is what a message?
Some people think not just there is no contribution whatsoever that people in the neighboring Arab countries or scholars in Arab countries.
So it depends who you ask. That's what I was about to say. I can give you two completely contradictory narratives, and they're both true. Okay, so let's keep that in mind. The first narrative is that we're in a really exciting moment of a kind of, renaissance. It's small, but it's growing, and the stuff that's being done is super interesting. Al-Mughbihar is right at the center of this, but it's, involving other people. It's kind of happening simultaneously on two fronts. One is, sort of the cooperation between bilingual Palestinian citizens of Israel with Israelis, mostly, Mizrahim, who are collaborating on anthologies and translations. And there's also, Ars Poetica, which is a kind of different energy, but it's really, Ars Poetica is in a way the most significant internal cultural phenomenon in Israel that's happening right now. I mean, just sort of the kind of, repopularization of poetry and literature. They've done something huge, whether or not you like them. And they don't exist as Ars Poetica anymore, but the individuals have been influential. They've gotten a ton of press. So that's one story you can tell. And you can say that, yes, there's, a lot of translation happening. Al-Mugh's been very successful at getting his own work translated into Arabic. All of that is good, okay? The pessimistic story is that, and I might be wrong, so I'm totally happy to be corrected, I don't think that any of this is having any real kind of meaningful effect on sort of the overall cultural edifice maybe with the exception of Ars Poetica, but, the other activity, I don't really see at this point how it sort of changed the cultural conversation in Israel, nor the sort of self-perception of most Israelis in terms of what culture means to them. I think that I might be wrong, but I think that for most Israelis, except for the people who are actually involved in these activities, if you ask them what's worth reading, most of the time it's not even Hebrew literature. What most Israelis want to read is foreign literature translated into Hebrew. Most of them feel like most Hebrew literature is not even worth their time, let alone, most Israelis, if they have no connection at all and you stop them on the street and you ask them about Arabic, I've had conversations where taxi drivers ask me what I do for a living, and I tell them, and they say, Arabic literature? What Arabic literature? There's no Arabic literature. They're in denial. They don't even believe, even if I tell them that, there are novels in Arabic. So I think that there's, and to that point, the works from Arabic that are translated into Hebrew do not sell. Okay, it is a losing enterprise economically. I might be wrong, my information might be outdated, but at the point where I was researching this for my book, I focused on the case study of Yael Lera's Al-Andalus Press, and it was an economic disaster. I mean, I spoke with her personally about it. We had a long conversation over the phone, like, you know, critically, every translation that came out was reviewed in Haaretz, and the critics loved it, but she could not sell the books. Israelis were not interested in reading fiction translated from Arabic. And so...
What about the other direction, Israeli Hebrew literature translated into Arabic,
Yeah.
and its impact in the Arab world?
I don't know. I honestly, you know, that's a great question. I don't know how commercially how successful it is. I really don't know. But that's been really problematic because, you know, so a lot of the Arabic translation that was actually done was not done in the Arab world. I mean, some of it was done in Beirut, like Sipur al Khoshech, I think, came out in Beirut, but like most of it, I think, was coming out in Germany with what was it called? Verlag? This like expatriate Iraqi press that was based in Cologne. Like, it is difficult to get Hebrew literature published in the Arab world because of the normalization
But I
debates.
think
You know?
is published in Cairo, isn't it? You know, I mean,
Yeah, and I mean, they do sell them at the book fair in Cairo every year, so it's there, but I don't know how much of a market there is, honestly. I just don't know how to answer the question.
I mean, that brings another question about what works are being translated and what is popular. So you can think of Eli Amir maybe as popular in Egypt or in the Arab world for a particular reason rather than other writers. But then if you think about Amos Oz and David Grossman and Aleph Bet Yehoshua, who are the most popular Israeli writers in America, and then maybe in Europe, from the little bit that I know, they have a whole different set of characters. So that's also interesting, you know. We're thinking that Edgar Keret is writing for, many people said that Amos Oz at some point also is writing really for international, you know, for the translation in English. He's already anticipating it.
Also, just to add to the Al-Andalus example, there was a wonderful press that Peter Kohl, who I mentioned in my talk, founded with his wife Adina Hoffman, Ibis Editions. And they had this Levantine conception that included Hebrew and Arabic, Ladino, English, German, and they translated Taha Muhammad.
They translated a bunch of stuff. They were great.
Bunch of stuff. It was wonderful.
Sam's book.
I don't know how. I don't know how profitable it was. In fact, I don't think they drew salaries at all. And then he won a MacArthur grant, and that was the end of Ibis Edition. So I think,
that's a whole different question.
Yeah.
I mean, how do you see the success? You know, is the success really a matter of commercial, or whether it has an impact on the culture? Like, the fact that we say that something is written about in Haaretz, maybe that's actually a sign of failure, because it means such a small circle of people are actually writing about it and reading it, and the rest of the world doesn't care, whether in Israel or anywhere else. So that's.
Yeah. So
and it's very.
that's recent. I agree.
I think it's
Is it selling? I don't know.
It is selling.
That's good.
It is
Okay.
selling, and.
So that's a hopeful sign. I mean, but just one other thing about your point. So, you sort of asked, like, sort of what's the role of the Middle East or the Arab world or the East? And I think it's like a question that can't really be answered in terms of Israel, because I think that for even like the third generation Mizrahim, their whole relationship to Arabness, whatever that is, or to Middle Eastern identity is so totally mediated at this point. Like, it's not, we have to be honest, like, it's not, they're not from these countries. They're not native speakers of these languages. It's totally acquired. So I'm not saying that it's not real. I'm not saying it's artificial, because I'm not an essentialist. But it is something that they're coming to usually after their sort of like formative, educational influences, which are by and large not, I mean, at least on a literary, sort of formal level, anything, from the Middle East or the Arab world. Like, even someone like Almog Bahar, as we've said, I mean, even in his family, it's not like he grew up even hearing Arabic at home. Right? And like some people do still, but we have to understand that. Like, it's a very intentional, culture can be acquired. I'm not saying that there's anything inauthentic about what Almog is doing, again, because I'm not an essentialist, but it's not like there's a pure, if we're talking about influence, we can't say like, oh, he's, influenced by Iraqi culture, Egyptian culture. He is, but it's because he's looking for it. It's not the kind of influence that you have when you're a child and you're not consciously thinking about it, and it's just something that you absorbed. right? And so I think that that's what we have to sort of think about, like, when we're talking about, on the Jewish side, you know, when we're talking about Mizrahi writers, or as we said, even like, you know, ethnically Ashkenazi writers who want to, you know, absorb themselves. Like, I mean, Tal Ben Tzvi, as far as I know, she's Ashkenazi, right? She's like completely immersed in all of this. You don't have to be ethnically, you know, Arab Jewish, but like somebody who sort of consciously takes this on as a project, right? It's a project, so it's very different than like having a sort of innate, you know.
And I would just add that in this context, it's important to compare, you know, people who are studying Yiddish as a kind of foreign language, whether they come from Ashkenazi or Mizrahi, and, you know, and then produce work like, for example, Matan Hermoni Hebrew Publishing Company, which is really kind of Yiddish in New York, but in Hebrew, right? Can you compare, you know, what Almog Bahar is doing with Arabic and Matan Hermoni is doing with Yiddish? That's an interesting question to ask.
Like Mati Shmuelov is also interesting because he's sort of like he's into the Hebrew and Mizrahi stuff and Arabic. He's in Berlin, so it's like
he's learning German.
I was actually just going to bring him up because in response to Mustafa's question, I mean, I think that yes, we can sort of talk about the regional context and about Israel within the Arab world, but we're also, I mean, part of what we're doing is trying to broaden the geographical scope. And if you look at someone like Mati Shmuelov, who's based in Berlin, who's another example, apropos Jeff's question of, I think it says that he lives, you know, on the path of takeoff and landing between Berlin and Tel Aviv. So like it's this very privileged identity, right, of living between these two centers. But for him, it's very significant that he's in Berlin surrounded by Arabs and Turks, and you know, and writes about this. I mean, more I think in his essays for Haaretz than in his literary writing, but about the significance of going to a cafe in Kreuzberg and meeting, you know, Iranian exiles and being able to talk to them in a way that he wouldn't be able to do in the Israeli context. So, you know, it's not just a kind of Mizrahi coming to terms with Arabic as part of his Jewish heritage, but also coming to terms with Arabic and other languages as part of this broader kind of phenomenon of mass migration and globalization and so on.
And with German as well, right? I mean, he's now integrating German, even though this is not the language of his grandparents or...
Right. And just to add very briefly to what Lital was saying, in terms of translation and the power differential, the book that I talked about this morning, the Darwish State of Siege, was translated into Hebrew by Mohammed Hamza Naim, so someone who is Palestinian, and that happens a lot more often than the other way around, which I can't think of an example, but you probably, if anyone you would know an example of someone so this is a Palestinian translating from Arabic to Hebrew. I don't know of an example of an Israeli Jew translating from Hebrew to Arabic, for example. I think that happens very often, that the translators of Arabic to Hebrew, thinking of, we're at U of M, thinking of someone like Anton Shamas and a lot of people, that to me is a lot more common and very indicative of the
power dynamic.
Right, the fact that Palestinians have to, or a lot of Palestinians have to know Hebrew. And not the other way around.
Well, no, so Ballas translated from Arabic to Hebrew. Yael is saying, you know, are there any Jews who translated from Hebrew to Arabic? I can only think of the other way. I think you're right. Sasson Somech translated from Arabic to Hebrew. Ballas translated from Arabic to Hebrew. I can't think of any Jews who translated into Arabic. Palestinian Israelis have done both. They've been Hebrew to Arabic and Hebrew to Arabic, and then the other translators of Hebrew to Arabic have been like Egyptians who acquired Hebrew as a second language, mostly, or Iraqis or whatever. Yeah.
So a comment to your question and also to what Rachel was saying. I just think whether we should maybe pluralize world literature and speak, you know, because I'm thinking, what if we're kind of speaking of Hebrew as a minor to other major literatures, but what if we kind of looked at it more, what if we looked at like Arab literature in relationship to Hebrew literature and thought about, you know, the world literature, how Arab literature functions as its own world literature, including into it also Hebrew literature. So I'm just saying, like, we can change the perspective and look at multiple perspectives of like what and what that would change. And I'm also thinking about all the kind of how going to foreign countries and creating little enclaves there of Hebrew writers or Hebrew speakers, which is what like people did in the early 20th century and still continuing to do, like it's not a condition of encounter necessarily. It really feels like an internal conversation, an ongoing internal conversation. So what I'm trying to say here is that, like, when all the times that you referenced world literature, I felt like you were talking about kind of how Hebrew literature is taking into its scope other literatures rather than.
Well, it depends. I mean, it can mean different things. So,
Yeah.
I mean, you can use world literature in the sense of sort of the canon of, great works written throughout the world. Usually in the early 20th century, that refers to European literature. And so that's using it in a very specific sense. When I talk about Hebrew's engagement with world literature, like in that sense, like in the period that, Naomi was describing, that's what I meant. But when I'm talking about world literature in the sense of the big, expansive critical discourse, then I'm talking about something different. So I'm not sure which
But
you're.
I'm just saying, how does Hebrew literature function in the world literature system of Arab, like where Arabic is the dominant language?
I think good example is Alf Layla wa Layla. And Alf Layla 1001 Night. And that's during the early 20th century, the world literature included Alf Layla wa Layla, 1001 Night.
Yeah.
Not only the Greeks, not only the European literature. And I wrote an article actually about 1001 Night, and it will be published in the Journal of Levantine Studies, the translation of Rivlin. And that translation, when I tried to acquire it, was translated in 1940s, and he finished the translation 1960s, early 1960s. And I was trying to acquire a copy of the translation. It is out. It is not out there. And the publishing house, I think, they reproduced another volume, another edition. It's called album edition, and in an indication that the book is selling and people are reading it.
Yeah.
And in this book is the Jew is represented in Alf Layla wa Layla as part and parcel of the fabric of the Levantine, if I'm going to take Jacqueline Kahanoum's notion of Alf Layla wa Layla as the embodiment of cosmopolitan society in the region.
Yeah. So just to respond to Maya's point, there's a book by Alexander Beecroft called An Ecology of World Literatures, and there he sort of breaks down world literature into different systems at different, like he does sort of more what you're talking about, where he'll look at sort of how, rather than thinking of like a unified world literature, he'll say, well, you can look at like the case of an empire where there's like a, one official language and then many other languages, and he'll talk about like, I don't know, I can't remember what his example was, but Sanskrit or something, and then he'll look at like a cosmopolitan example. So he looks at different moments in history in different regions, and he looks at sort of what different models of world literature could look like. So, I mean, people have done that kind of work. It's not as though the discourse just assumes that there's only one, like,
I was trying to kind of decenter Hebrew a little bit.
So you're saying like what would Hebrew look like in a different,
What?
you're saying what would Hebrew look like in a sort of different model that takes it out of the sort of the global circulation?
Yeah, I mean, for us, even though we recognize, the minority of Hebrew, for us right now in our internal intellectual discussion, Hebrew is at the center, and Yiddish and
I see.
German and Arabic and Russian are peripheral.
Well, if I could ask one question about like going back to the material I presented at the very beginning, I'm just curious to know, because it hasn't come up at all in the discussion, but I kind of am genuinely curious to know if we can have a moment of self-reflection to think about sort of where we've come since, I mean, even thinking back to just when we were all graduate students, and maybe going further back to, what we know about like the sort of, if we accept that maybe like the first work that was done on Hebrew literature that took it out of the, kind of nationalist framework of, Hebrew in Israel was the Hebrew Yiddish work that was done by Harshav and later by Hannah Kronfeld, if that's accurate. And I was talking about sort of like the structuralist influences and so forth. I am curious, first of all, to know sort of how we look back at that, and if that sort of relates to your question about how we're seeing Hebrew at the center, even if we're discussing multilingualism. But I'm also like really curious to kind of talk to you all about how we put together, again, sort of the different types of work that we're all doing within a frame of Israeli multilingualism, given that each one has a sort of separate trajectory. And that was why I brought up how when people started working on Mizrahi literature and like the Hebrew Arabic, I mean, it was kind of coming from a different place. Nobody at all was thinking about how to relate that to Hebrew and Yiddish, at all. And that was really
Which
much...
is a problem.
Yeah,
I think we should.
I mean, I kind of wanted to put that out there because it's sort of a question about like where do we go next. That's something that, as you know, that was what brought me and Allison together initially. We were like, wow, like you've been doing the Hebrew Yiddish stuff, I've been doing the Hebrew Arabic stuff. Let's have a conversation. But I think in a way, like they come from very different places, both in terms of sort of going back to the history of how this work started happening and what the conversations were and what they were trying to achieve politically as well. Right. And so like bringing them together in a way is kind of imposing this frame where Hebrew is still at the center, but then there's like, there's Hebrew and Yiddish, there's Hebrew and Arabic, there's Hebrew and whatever. So, back to you. Like, what do you guys think about that?
Actually, okay, you go.
No, it's interesting that we're sort of now expressing some anxiety about Hebrew being at the center, because if I follow sort of the trajectory that you sketched out in your lecture, Lital, beginning with, if we look at someone like Hannah Kronfeld, right, trying to decenter things, let's say, and she's responding directly to Deleuze and Guattari, who have a very specific definition of what a minor literature is, right, and it has to be written in a major language. So Kafka is the prime example, right, and what she's doing is saying, well, wait a minute, what about all of these minor languages that we're now overshadowing, that we're forgetting about? So they're very much, it's bringing them sort of into the discussion. And now it's sort of like we've come so far that we're expressing some anxiety over the fact that Hebrew has become kind of the major language, or at least the central language in the context of our discussion. And so it's almost as though the pendulum needs to swing back the other way. I don't know exactly what the answer to the dilemma is, but it's interesting that that's where we're at.
But if you think about it historically, if you look at least the Yiddish writers, this is something that they experienced not as scholars, but as writers in the 50s. They felt that Hebrew is already becoming the center, and they are at the periphery. So it's kind of there's a mirror of the cultural process that happened that we are experiencing now as we are doing research about it. But I just wanted to add, because it's something that I grapple with a lot. I think that it's really necessary to do it in a comparative way. So I learned a lot from reading your book about Arabic, and I think the terms are the theoretical terms, and the way the discussion is very relevant when you work on other languages. And at the same time, I don't want politically say that it's the same, because the political dynamics between Hebrew and Arabic, and Hebrew and Yiddish, and Hebrew and German, and Hebrew and Russian and English, they are all very different, right? I think we have to be very clear about that. And it's very easy, for example, if I work on politically, if I work on Yiddish, to say that this kind of work is saying that somehow the Ashkenazic hegemony, I'm trying to undermine it and say that if I'm looking at it from the point of view of Yiddish writers or German writers, it might be the same. It's kind of on the same level as Mizrahim or Palestinians who are writing in Arabic. We have to be very clear about these different power dynamics in terms of the ideology. At the same time, this work has to be done comparatively and maybe even together, which is what we're doing right now.
I think to a certain degree, our use of center and periphery, which has been so central and I think implicit in a lot of what we've been talking about today, takes us back to the kind of diaspora home dichotomy, right?
Yeah,
It doesn't, you can map it on spatially in a very neat way and all of those things. And so I guess my question becomes, if in shifting or even aiming towards transnationalism, does it give us some sort of alternative to the center periphery, center margin model that, well, I'll speak for myself, is a very comfortable, very familiar place to be, but perhaps one that needs to be shaken up more. And so I think, you asked the question in terms of how far have we come, or where are we with respect to, that Hannah's work on the margins and the center. And I think things are certainly changing, and we see a much broader range here beyond the Hebrew and Yiddish. But it's a good opportunity to ask ourselves, how much are we just relying still on the center margins or center periphery out of habit rather than truly it being the most effective framework?
I think that's one of the things that comes up now a lot in transnational theory. Lital, you mentioned the book that was edited by Françoise Lyonnais. And they talk about that specifically, that, you know, one of the problems particular, and this is their critique, I think, of the post-colonial model, is that we always end up talking about major, minor, center, periphery. But what about the various margins, and how do we bring those into closer contact? And I think that's sort of, I mean, that should be what is at the heart of the transnational turn.
Right, exactly.
So maybe the collaboration, it's wonderful that you have this ongoing collaboration, but like, we need to triad it or add multiple parts to it from other literatures. And you were doing something similar with the Nachta, right? Or thinking about across, you know, different cultures, wasn't it?
The
with
the
Chinese
alternative
and-
modernities, which
Yeah,
is like my infinitely deferred project where I was going to compare all the different literary renaissances.
Wondering why that was deferred in the world. No, this is for dinner. But why that was deferred in the you know, Jewish world
It
literature.
just was like, it
Israeli
was not a
literature.
pre-tenure project, that's why.
But yeah,
Yeah.
but you know, to take up that challenge would be
Yeah.
to work outside the disciplinary
But I
or
guess-
national boundaries.
Like I'm sorry if I'm beating a dead horse, but like I'm really curious. I'd love to know what you think about the whole theoretical conversation around Hebrew and Yiddish, which has definitely grown and developed, but really did come a lot out, because of Chana, out of, you know, the Deleuze and Guattari, and then again, Evan Zohar, versus the theoretical conversation around Hebrew and Arabic, which from the beginning was, again, you know, Said, Fanon, later Baba. And that's what I'm curious about, because I feel like you can bring, it's not, I mean, Chaco's totally right about the politics, but beyond that, like methodologically, bringing them together is kind of difficult, because at this point they each have their own history and their own trajectory, you know, and they're like really distinct.
Although,
So,
just part of what
Yeah.
makes that particularly interesting is that when you actually read the literatures together, not only the notion of them being written, at least in the Palestinian, sometimes Lebanese context, about the same place, it's also so clearly the languages are so close in a lot of ways, and so there can be so many examples of it would be very easy and compelling to play around with that a lot more than is done in the literature, but also in how we read those two literatures together. So it seems to me like there's so much potential there that the fact that it's I think still understudied, I think is telling of extra-disciplinary trends.
I think also when we look at some specific writers, there are some really interesting intersections. Like Yael and I were talking earlier about Almog Behar and this tendency to sort of classify him as a Mizrahi writer. But he's also talked about, he has a very mixed heritage.
Yeah.
One of his, German is another heritage language, Dutch is another language of one of his grandfathers. And he writes about that too. That's not the literature that's highlighted, right?
Yeah.
In part, I think, because of that he just ascended to fame with Ana Min al Yahud, and that became his kind of trademark story. But there are, you know, and people are now writing about this too. So there, or someone like Mati Shmuelov, I brought this poem that came out apropos social media, he published it on the internet, called Germanit Shvura von ein Judendichter, which already has Yiddish in the title accidentally. He doesn't know Yiddish, right? And he writes it in German and in Hebrew, but then puts in words like voila, and, you know, so there's this kind of Mizrahi flavor to it. And that has to do with him being in Berlin and being surrounded by Ashkenazi culture. So I think that this doesn't offer us a theoretical framework, but it's really interesting to see certain writers where these different lines are actually intersecting, and then it'll be up to us to figure out how to deal with that in terms of theory and criticism.
Right, so brings us back to what Leora was pointing out, this kind of multiplicity of multilingualism. It's not just that certain writers are working with Hebrew and German, or Hebrew and Arabic, or Hebrew and Yiddish, but it's always already in a context of a multilingual context, more than one language.
I think also, and this may be the start of a response, it's certainly not a response to your question, but the best case scenario is the different, I suppose, theoretical genealogies of the approaches to Hebrew and Yiddish and Hebrew and Arabic, just to take two, and again, don't want to distill it only to those two, but they've got track records here. I think, you know, there is the potential, and some of this has happened already, the question, can more happen, to kind of the crossovers. So what I'd point to specifically is I think the attention to power and power asymmetries that was really absent from the early polysystem stuff.
Right.
Was probably a bit more present as it gets translated into the study of Hebrew and Yiddish, but is something that's lacking from the earlier stuff that I believe, and please correct me if I'm wrong, was more central to the post-colonial kind of genealogy that the Hebrew and Arabic studies are coming from, and it's something that is missing in those earlier Yiddish studies, and I think is in the process of being addressed. And it's different. I'm not going to say, I mean, I don't even want to pretend that the power asymmetries are similar, but they're important. So that's one very small piece where there's the potential for mutual kind of illumination.
Yeah, you know.
I just wanted to add, and I guess this is sort of my particular contribution to this conversation, that, right, although the particular literary exchanges are perhaps simply Yiddish Hebrew or Arabic Hebrew or whatever, when you look at the social context in which these things are occurring, that social context is itself mixed. So for example, this Yiddish speaker might be living in an apartment right next door to the Arabic speaker, or maybe is buying vegetables from, you know, the Arab woman down the street. I mean, this is the stuff that I write about, but the fact is that when you take your lens away from the literature and say what kinds of experience, I mean, Abu Tor in Adriana's work, right? It seems irrelevant to the analysis you give, but you mention it, all of a sudden you bring us into this social context. And I wonder if part of the answer to this question is kind of, I mean, it requires a certain interdisciplinarity, but to open up that zoom, you know, that lens, telephoto lens, and see kind of what else is in the picture besides the literary exchanges per se.
Yeah, I want to just add to that because I remember giving an early version of my Harold Schimmel talk like 10 years ago maybe. It was at the NAF at Stanford. And I was at the last panel of the last day. So by then everybody was completely exhausted. And then I was like, I'm just going to give this talk on Harold Schimmel and Robert Lowell. It didn't even occur to me that, you know, maybe half the room wouldn't know really anything about Robert Lowell, or that maybe no one really knew Harold Schimmel. And after the talk, it was just, actually someone came up to me and said, you're really marginalizing yourself in the field. And it was like a really, no, but I'm not telling you how I responded. But let's just say I persevered. No, it's something that stayed with me, because at that moment I was like, wow, this is one of those moments, right? I can say like, I'm going to just go more mainstream. I'm going to work about the things that everyone knows about, like just abandon Harold Schimmel entirely. But I think part of it is that we have to just keep, I think what Shahar was saying, the comparative frameworks are really important, and to keep sort of insisting on them. Because the reality is Robert Lowell was in Israel, maybe just for 2 weeks out of his entire life, and maybe I'm making more of a big deal about it than it is. But I think it's sort of a meaningful thing that he was there, especially a year after '67 war. He's touring the country, he's talking to these poets, and if you go to his biographies, this visit in Israel is mentioned, it's described. I mean, it's not like just something that disappears from recorded history. And so, but I think that, I think sometimes we can get a little too comfortable treading the same ground because people are familiar with it, they have a context. I think part of the work that I think all of us have been doing is really insisting on sort of, we found these little areas that we're really interested in, and we keep working in it, and we hope that eventually sort of we'll draw in the students and the readers, and they'll take on a bigger life. But I think part of it is working against this, you know, sort of entrenched narratives of what Hebrew literature should be, who's important, which texts are the most important by certain writers, and we're missing, I think Mustafa's point is really critical. It gets so, even within the internal dynamics, it gets even more narrow, and that's something that I think we have to continuously work against. Right?
I think you talked just a little bit more on this. The question is not just about the theoretical differences between, you know, the study of Hebrew Yiddish and Hebrew and Arabic, but it's also about institutional politics.
Yeah, that's my point.
Right,
Exactly.
and I think like the whole crusade, like for the joint literary historiography, was about like feeling marginalized in California, and this speaks to what you're saying. the poor exiles in California. No, but that's first of all changing, you know, because of the map, the institutional map,
has
and
changed.
how you know these ideas have spread. Whereas, like, it seems more like the study of Hebrew and Arabic seemed institutionally more indigenous to Israel, and that might be also changing. So I think, like, we are seeing like finally like a more of a collaboration, and I hope so. I hope that continues.
Any more questions, comments? Last chance.
Yeah.
Yeah, Nadav.
We should end there.
I kind of want to use Leora's notion of moving away maybe from language and introducing the lens of genre or the lens of style into the conversation. So what are we doing, for instance, with, you know, both contemporary and modernist writing like Goldberg, like Vogel, like Elisheva, and on, you know, contemporary level, like Hoffman, Mishani, that are not necessarily obviously using a interaction of languages, but are bringing into Hebrew or are exporting Hebrew into a different context, kind of via genre or via style, you know, introducing into Hebrew literature haiku or Asian aesthetic, introducing into literature the genre of the detective novel and what is it doing within Hebrew contemporary literature, and, you know, thinking about Vogel, is he a writer of world literature, not necessarily of Hebrew literature? So kind of introducing that into our matrix.
Sorry, what was the last part you said? That Vogel is a writer of what? And not
World
Of world literature, why is he, I mean, we tend to think of him as an outsider. Is he an outsider? How do we think of his example, what Legoldberg is bringing into Hebrew poetry in terms of the models she's introducing?
Wasn't that part of what the new anthology was trying to do, to present people like Vogel and Goldberg as German, kind of bringing them back to Germany, and that's why via that to world literature, right?
But to speak to genre, why only poetry? You know, why does poetry, or in a specific kind of poetry, celebrate the 50 years of relations? You know, as if that the contact between languages and the peoples has to be in the sphere of like poetry only, you know, and also very metaphysical, kind of a very certain type of poetry also. It won't be Shima or experimental poetry or like, you know, not minimalist, but I'm trying to think of, like, there are other, you know, possibilities there, but it's very much a poetry like infused with Germanness. So I don't. This is not an answer, but I was also reflecting on kind of the privileging of a specific mode of writing. I don't know. If there
No,
are
I mean, I
thoughts
think
of
today
that.
our point of departure has been linguistic. That was just sort of our conceptual organizing point, and that's why we've stuck to that. And you're interjecting, I think, another dimension, something really interesting, something that I think certainly within a transnational context, and I could probably pick up on a couple more keywords, but I'm going to stick with that and say we could swap that out. There are a lot of other things to throw into the arena. Whether it's stylistic, whether it's the issue of genre. I don't think language is by any means the only or even the primary organizing conceptual principle. It's just where perhaps this can be a start for other conversations that may be similar in their outlines and not, and who knows, you know, to some degree similar, but go in many other different directions as well in their actual details.
I think different concerns about multilingualism definitely manifest themselves differently in different genres, and that is something we haven't, I mean, we could, if we had the energy and the time, we could spend a whole other session talking about, but I mean, I'm thinking, for example, of Lea Goldberg's Avedot, which really is such a European novel. It's a kind of Künstlerroman, right, like this artist novel, and yet it's constantly, there are all these moments of sort of meta-linguistic moments where the protagonist is sort of deeply anxious about the fact that he writes in Hebrew, right? He himself is a Hebrew poet, and like, who's going to read me? And, you know, all of these Hasidic Jews wandering around the Scheunenviertel in Berlin, they're not going to read me, but neither are these these Europeans who can't read any Hebrew. So there's, I mean, we have within this genre of the novel what we could describe as a quintessential kind of great European novel, but the fact that it's written in Hebrew is already a kind of linguistic problem that it meditates on self-consciously. So yeah, it's a really interesting topic that...
And it's connected, of course, to world literature and the fact that Lea Goldberg, when she was writing it, she was also thinking institutionally about world literature, right?
Yeah, I was going to add that genres, we can look at them as some kind of aesthetic and cultural institutions. They have historical memory from also places that they came from, and also they circulate really differently economically. When I was trying to write about film, visual art, and literature, and well, trying to write in one dissertation, I realized that those are very uneven institutional genres, and to be successful, let's say, in painting, it's not the same as being successful in literature in terms of kind of reinforcement, economic reinforcement that you get. So it's definitely something that we can add to different cultural worlds of world literature and world cinema and other worlds.
Yeah, and also how the poem circulates within this sort of model of world literature versus novels, for example, is also something that we can't sort of align. I mean, it needs to be distinguished. We're talking about very distinct economies as well. So even the example of Vogel, you know, and Goldberg is sort of interesting because they're, you know, two poets, right? So, although most of our examples have been Avedot, but in her poetry as well, and we see this in work.
Okay, thank you very much. This was an incredible day, and I know it's very productive for me, and I'm sure for everybody else. I hope also for the audience, and thank you very much.